Today, Mapping Mortgage Stress, October 2022. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Last Tuesday I ran a live show and I went through quite a lot of details about the latest modelling and outcomes from our mortgage stress analysis. This show is an edited version which just focuses specifically in on what we found. And so we look at the overall summary of mortgage stress and also drill down into the maps. And the maps are very interesting because it highlights where the most significant hotspots are. And specifically this time we've mapped as a percentage of households rather than the count. Let me just quickly remind you, so there will be some new people on. I model this on an ongoing basis. I survey households and look at the various elements, including from our surveys, and also pull information from other sources into our core market model. And that includes our rolling household phone surveys. So this is up-to-date data. We get it back each week. And I ran the models up till the end of the month. And we can slice and dice the data and also put some data into our various scenarios. We'll touch on the scenarios a bit later. And that allows us then to have a look down to the postcode level and think about things like mortgage stress, the trajectory, the buying and selling intentions, migration, economics, and put it through the core market model and then come up with an estimate of where things may be going. And this is down to a postcode level. Because one of the things I keep saying is you cannot look just at these aggregate levels. So the core logic indices is quite unhelpful. One, it's lagged by perhaps up to 70 days, and two, it's too generic. It doesn't really differentiate sufficiently in particular geographies and locations. So it's pretty important to get granular, and that's what I try to do in my modelling. And incidentally, just on passing, for those who are interested in perhaps a more detailed conversation about a particular area, I do that for my one-to-one service. It's a confidential conversation. We can give you data about a particular postcode. It's not financial advice, but I can look at the underlying trends and data. I can look at stress, home price, and some trending ahead based on the modelling. About an hour by Zoom or phone. And there's a charge involved simply because it's a lot of work to put it all together. And if you're interested in getting information about that, then you go to my blog. On the blog, there's a contact me form, and you can actually ask for more information. We're booking about 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment. And I will just make the point that I've got quite a few queries on my inbox. I'm a bit behind just because I've been so busy, but I will get to them. So even if you haven't heard back from me in a week or two, don't worry, I will get back to you in due course. All right, now let's talk about the mortgage stress and definition of stress. There are many different definitions, of course, but I use a cash flow measure, money in, money out. That's really important these days because it also means that I'm thinking about not only the mortgage, but the other costs. You know, we know the inflation rate's very high. We know the cost of vegetables and other non-discretionary issues are all there. So this is actually quite an important way of thinking about it. So cash flow terms, money in, money out. And if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items, than income, then we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, then they're in mortgage stress. If they're renting, they're in rental stress. And investors with cash flow pressures are identified as stressed investors. And we can also aggregate the data to total financial stress, which is all types of stress from all categories of households. And we can calculate it as a percentage of households and the count in each postcode. I use the latter most of the time, but tonight I'm going to show you the percentages because a few people were asking last time about the percentage in postcodes, so I'll show some mapping later on that. Now let's look at mortgage stress as October 22, so this is the latest data. And the first thing to say is that rental stress is still at a massively high 61.44%. It came back very slightly compared with last month. That's partly because some people are moving to cheaper accommodation or moving back with parents, but also the fact that in some areas, some of the rental scenarios are a little bit different from where they were a couple of months ago, but it's still very high, 61% of households. Mortgage stress is at 45.2. It's just back very, very slightly, very close to the last month. That's because some people are refinancing. And by refinancing, some people are able to get themselves back into slightly better situations, not least because when they refinance, a lot of people, about 2/3, pull equity out of the property too and pays down debt, which means it improves their cash flow in the short term, but only in the short term. It doesn't solve anything unless they change their behaviour. And then the third one is just on household debt. This is from the RBA data, and you'll notice it's going up again. So 187.5 is the ratio. Now that's a bit deceptive because that's all households, including those not borrowing and SMEs. So you need to multiply up about 3 times to get the true ratio. So it's about 187, let's say 200 times 3, so 600 times the ratio between the debt and income. In other words, people are 6 times, on average, 6 times income. That's pretty high. Now, here is the data for October, and as normal, I just displayed it by state. You can see here that overall mortgage stress is at 45.19%, rental stress is 61.44%, investor stress is at 21%, and financial stress is at 43%. Now, I've marked them here. If it's bluey, that means that it's an improvement on last month. If it's yellow, it's worse than last month. So you can see here that for mortgage stress, there was an improvement in New South Wales and the ACT. That's very much associated with people who've refinanced in the last couple of months. Whereas in the Northern Territories, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, they're all gone up. WA's come down a bit, again because of refinancing, and the overall total is very similar to last month. In terms of rental stress went up in the ACT, and it went up in South Australia and Western Australia, and it came down slightly in New South Wales, NT, Queensland, Tasmania, but really isn't hugely different from last month. Investor stress was higher in ACT, New South Wales, Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australia. That's because of higher mortgage payments now on investment properties, and even if they've put the rent up, it's not necessarily enough to cover the costs. A little bit of an improvement in Tasmania, no change in Victoria and Western Australia, and so it was around 21%. And then financial stress, which is the aggregate measure, shows that it was down slightly in ACT and New South Wales, up in the Northern Territory and South Australia, down in Queensland, down in Tasmania, up in Victoria, up in Western Australia, and the overall total was pretty close. And you can see here the count. So 1.7 million households in mortgage stress, 1.9 million households in rental stress. And overall, of the 9.7 million households, financial stress is touching just over 4.2 million households, or 43% of households. So it's quite significant. Here's the segment data, and I won't go into this into a huge amount of detail, but just to highlight that mortgage stress is highest amongst young growing families, including a lot of first-time buyers, at 84%. It's also high on the urban fringe and in the battling urban groups at 73% and 67%. A little lower in some other dimensions. Rental stress, of course, is highest amongst the first-generation Australians, what I call the multicultural establishment, and also some older households who are long-term renters, as well as some wealthy seniors and young affluents and some young growing families, so it's quite widely spread. Investor stress, funnily enough, those with more investment properties like exclusive professionals and young affluents are where the most of the stress is, so property investors are struggling at the moment. A lot of returns are negative. And overall financial stress is highest amongst young growing families, of course. That includes first-time buyers, battling urban, so those on the fringe, and also young affluents. Those are the people who have higher incomes, perhaps younger, but also massive mortgages. And a lot of it's to do with the size of the mortgages they have. Now, let's just quickly run through mortgage stress. So what I've done is just given the top few, and I've sorted it by the number of households in a particular postcode. So the postcode with the highest number is in Liverpool, 2170, with more than 11,500. And then a WA postcode 6065, including Tapping, with 11,000. Then we go to areas around Toowoomba at 4350, more than 10,000. Then we go to Roxburgh Park and places like that in Victoria at 3064 with 9,900. Then another postcode at Hoppers Crossing, 3029 with 9,000. Now, this last two, and Narrow Warren, the next one, 3805, including Fountain Gate and Narrow Warren with 9,000. These are all high growth corridor areas. Same to be true there at Berwick and Harkaway as well, 3806. So you can see the tranche of Victorian high growth corridors with a lot of households. Then we go to Riverston, including places like Nelson and Vineyard, Berkshire Park. And then we go to Cranbourne in Victoria, another high growth corridor. Back to places like Camden, 2570 with 8,000. Pakenham in Victoria, another high growth corridor, 8,200. Ballarat Regional Centre with more than 8,000. And then down to Tasmania, in and around Launceston, with more than 7,000 there. So that's the top stressed postcodes for mortgage stress. If I then do the same for rental stress, Toowoomba's right at the top of the list with more than 10,000 in rental stress. Then we go to Liverpool and 2170 with 9,700 rental stressed postcode house codes in that postcode. Then we go to Southport, Labrador on the Gold Coast, 9,300. Then we go to this one here at 3560, including Campbelltown and Lima and places like that. Then we go to Lethbridge Park and Bidwell. Then we go to Greystanes and Wentworthville and South Wentworthville and Westmead, still with more than 8,500. Then Waterloo, Zetland, New South Wales. Then down to Cranbourne again in Victoria with more than 8,000. Then we go to Ipswich and the areas around there with more than 8,000. Out to Parramatta and Harris Park with more than 7,700. Then up into the Central Coast around Gosford with more than 7,500. And up to the areas around Bundaberg with more than 7,300. If I then do the stressed investors, so these are the people with investment properties in these particular areas. So you can see that the investment properties in the centre of Melbourne are not doing well at all. They actually have some of the biggest counts. Then we go to Toongabbie, Crow's Nest, Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst in New South Wales, Newstead and Fortitude Valley in Queensland, Westmead into places like that in New South Wales. Then we go to Windaroo and Yatala. Then we go to Southport and Labrador again. Then Wyong in the Central Coast. Then close into the centre of Sydney, I guess a bit equivalent to Melbourne. And then St Kilda in Victoria, Highgate Hill in Queensland. And then we've got Lane Cove and places like that in New South Wales. And finally, financial stress overall is highest in Campbelltown, postcode 2560, followed by Toowoomba, 4350, 23,000, 22,000. Then Liverpool at 22,000. Then Cranbourne in Victoria, 18,000. Centre of Melbourne at 18,000. And then Mount Druitt, Bidwell, places like that, 2770 with 17,000. Hoppers Crossing with 17,000. Roxburgh Park, Craigieburn, 16,000. Ipswich, 15,000. Tapping, places like that, 14,900. Point Cook, Derrimut, 14,800. Southport, Labrador, up in Queensland, 14,300. Greystanes, Wentworthville, places like that, 14,100. And so it goes on. Tamworth is on the list at 14,000. Ballarat, another regional centre, at 13,000. And then we go back to Camden, Grasmere, and places like that at 13,000. So that gives you a bit of a flavour, as you can see how it all looks. So, of course, you can see here that the stress is spread quite broadly across different areas. A lot of newly developed postcodes, a lot of high growth corridors where a lot of people bought relatively recently, quite often at the top of the market. They've got big mortgages, they're highly leveraged. They're also in areas where the infrastructure is not great, so they're having to spend a lot more to get around. And of course, the cost of fuel is quite high at the moment as well. And they've also got more limited infrastructure more generally out there as well. So, but I will highlight that other areas too, like Central Coast, for example, is also in some difficulty. So wherever you look, there are these pockets. Now, I think it's going to continue to deteriorate because rates are still going up. Of course, it takes 2 to 3 months for the interest rates when they're actually announced to flow through. NAB announced, for example, today that they're going to start putting the rates up next week, I think the 11th of November, so I'm sure everybody else will follow on with that. It means that people will still be seeing their mortgage repayments going up higher and higher each month for the next few months, whatever the Reserve Bank does. So there's a lot more pain baked in, unfortunately, and whichever way you look at it, it's not a very pretty picture. What I wanted to do now was to show you some of the stress mapping, because I think the stress mapping is actually quite a powerful tool when it comes to looking at where the problem areas are. So I'm going to switch across to here. Now this is actually the stress map for Sydney. We can look at other areas as well. And I just want to explain, as I always do, that the lowest stress is the bluey ones, and the red and the orange ones are the higher. And you can see here on the key that you've got 7% and below, 7 to 19%, 19 to 31%, 31 to 43%, 43 to 57%, 57 to 72, 72 to 89, and 89 and above. So the more ready, the more the proportion of households are actually going to be in difficulty. And you can see here that you can immediately draw a bit of a line down Western Sydney from the Hills area down through Blackdown, down through Fairfield, down past Liverpool and into Campbelltown. That's where a lot of the hotspots are. And of course it's quite similar to the counts. I've shown you the counts on other occasions, but this is actually just a slightly different way of showing the same information. Now you've got to be careful, because if you have a very small household count with a high level of stress, it will still show as red. But nevertheless, it does make quite an interesting point. And then if you drill into areas around the harbour, for example, let's just go and do that, what you start to see is there are some interesting hotspots. So, for example, if you look at this, this is actually Cremorne 2090. So there's a lot of people there who are in some difficulty. Lane Cove is also one. And Gabby up there at 2146 is also not looking too good. If you go up a bit higher, you can see places like Castle Hill and the Ponds, Stanhope Gardens. That's all where that high growth corridor is. And if you go out this way, you can see that places like Riverston, above Blacktown Vineyard, all areas where you've got huge pressure. Now, if you then go up to the Northern Beaches, now whilst the overall proportions are still quite low, you can see there at Avalon in that area, there's a bit of a hotspot there, or if you look at Hornsby. And then if you go further up and look towards the Central Coast, you start seeing quite high proportions there too. So you can really get a sense of where the problem areas are. And so it's quite a useful thing. And what I tend to do personally is to look at both percentages and counts. But it does make the point quite well, I think, that things are actually quite distressed at the moment. Now, if I then go to, let's go to Brisbane, shall we? Do 4,000. Okay, so I'm now looking around, centered on 4,000, and you can see there, as I pull out, you start to see some interesting reddening of some of the areas. So over here, beyond Eagle Farm, you can see that there's actually some issues. Camp Hill, Lucia. As we pull further out and begin to see a little bit more of the wider areas, you can see that there are some interesting red areas. Some of this is some of the new development that's gone on quite recently. And then if you go further south, you've got Rockley and Salisbury and places like that. And as you pull out, you can sort of see more and more of the problem areas. And as you come a little bit south of Brisbane and head down towards the Gold Coast, you can start to see some quite concerning signatures there. And of course, if you go west, then you go into places like Toowoomba and Lockyer Valley and Ipswich, places like that. And then if you go up to the Sunshine Coast, again, you do see some, not massive, relative to some areas, but quite a high proportion. And quite a few people here bought relatively recently with very large mortgages, and that's really the explanation as to why we've got what we've got. Now, if we can go to Melbourne, we can do something of a similar exercise, and again looking in percentage terms. So we can start in the centre of Melbourne and pull out, and you can see there that they're already quite close in, up and around Essendon and Mooney, for example, and around Parkville. There are some hotspots. Heidelberg West, Preston, for example, is also showing up as being a bit of an issue. And as you pull out further, you start to see the ring of pain, as it were, around Melbourne. And as you go out west and east, some of the new high growth corridors that you would expect to see perhaps around Casey and places like that, out beyond the inner ring. And then if you look further out there, you start to see Wyndham and places like that over towards the west, areas up here to the north and west. And then if you go up towards Ballarat, you can also see areas there as well. So it's worth understanding that, you know, these hotspots, they're not just in the centre of Melbourne, but there are some in the centre of Melbourne, but there are also some regional centres too. So it really does make it really stand out. And places like Mitchell, for example, up there as well. Now, if I then go to South Australia briefly. Okay. So again, we're drilling out from the centre of Adelaide, and you can see again the same patchwork. So it's quite powerful when you start looking at these, and you can see that there are areas where there are significant issues. So Campbelltown, for example, here is standing out. Prospect, a few other places too. Hornsey Gale, Gully, for example. And there's a few interesting contrasts. So, you know, one of the things I quite often highlight is Salisbury in the area around there. That's got a very high count, but from a percentage perspective, it's not as high as some others. So it is quite interesting. And again, you get a slightly different view relative to some of the other pictures that I've produced. And, you know, you can pretty much be sure that where the colours are actually redder or orange, there's more likely to be more price falls ahead. Now we'll go across to Perth to 6,000. And again, we'll zoom out from the centre of Perth. And Perth has a very different profile when you start looking in percentage terms. You find closer into Perth, there are actually a few areas where there are some interesting issues. Netherlands, for example, which is perhaps not what you might expect, and Mount Lawley, for example, as well. And even in Mosman Park, it's not, you know, where you might expect to see it. Colleslow's not too bad. Other parts of the Netherlands, but, you know, if you look at this area around here, there's 6069, some issues. And as you pull out, you start to see those same trends, where if you go north and south of the centre of Perth, you then start to see higher representations of more extended stress. And as you go up the coast, so 6034, 6038, 6036, 6030, right there, you can see that. There's Wanneroo there. It's one of the ones in my list. And if you go south, Rockingham and further south, you can also see that there's quite a lot of issues there. Now I'm going to quickly go over to 7,000. This is in around Hobart. And again, we're looking at proportions, percentages. And what's quite significant here is that you do see some percentages. Now, the total count of households is a lot lower, of course, in this particular area. So they don't often stand out when you look at the counts. But when you look at the representation, for example, 7009 is a hotspot. And then you've got some overs here around Clarence City and places like that. So it does tell you quite an interesting story. And I won't do it now, but if you went up to the northern part of Tasmania, you'd also see somewhat similar things. Now I just want to do one last one, and that's Canberra, because I think Canberra is looking quite interesting, and there's quite a few concerning signs that I'm seeing. Now close into the centre, it's not looking too bad. This is obviously around Capitol Hill there. But if you start pulling out, you do then start to see areas where there are some interesting pressures. So 2902, for example, 2900. And even further out, you see some other areas too. So even across the ACT, there are some areas like 2609 where things are pretty good, others where there's some pressure, and others again where there's a lot more pressure. So it shows you the sort of the patchwork that we've got. So I hope that was useful in terms of just giving you a bit of a flavour of the way that the story is working. And you know, I tend to use both the percentage and also the count to be able to actually really drill into what's going on. Okay, so that's that little story. Now let's then just move on and talk a little bit about some of the postcodes. And I want to introduce you to my map of the postcode. This is the data that I use. You've seen this a few times. This is updated now to October. And so this is my summary down to the postcode level. So I have information about individual postcodes. I know the price scenarios, so best, base and worst case, and I'll talk about scenarios in a second. So scenarios are a way of sort of exploring the futures. It's not trying to make a prediction, it's just showing you what could be. And it's running forward from today. And we basically have best scenario, which assumes that interest rates are going to stick around the 2.5 to 2.75, you know, and fall next year. Inflation eases ahead of the RBA expectations. Wages rise faster and there's no recession in Australia. The base case is that rates go to about 3.5%, which will give you mortgage rates of about 6.7% and stay high through 2023, while inflation stays above target until 24, but no recession in Australia. The worst case is that rates go even higher, above 4%. That would put mortgage rates at 7% plus, stay high into 2024, along with inflation. Wages growth stalls due to recession, and later rates fall. So those are the scenarios that I'm using. And back to then the scenario. And I picked Wollongong just because that happened to be the one I was looking at the time. And you can see there we've got information about the count of households. We've got the number of mortgage stressed, rental stressed, investor stressed, and overall financial stress. Anyone watching the anti-spook videos will have seen this information. Then I've got my best case, worst case, and base case scenarios for houses and units and the graphs that attach to them. I've got the property profile, so I know how many houses, units, and others are there. I know also what the average people ratio, so how many people to properties in the area, which tells you something quite interesting. How many were vacant on census night last year, and the average gross investment yield and the net investment yield. I've got income data from the ATO and also from the household census, and that allows me to calculate the disposable monthly income, and that allows me then to estimate what proportion of monthly income is going to pay the mortgage and what proportion of monthly income on average is going to pay the average rent. So there you go, that's the way that it works. Now earlier on, JJ asked for information about 2450. So let's give it a go. So this is Coffs Harbour. And for Coffs Harbour at the moment, there's 18,700 households in the postcode. There's 35% owning outright, 32% are borrowing, 31% are renting, and 33% of those with a mortgage, or just over 2,000 in mortgage stress, 80% renting and rental stress, and there is some also mortgage stress for investment properties too. So overall the factor is about 40.6%. Scenarios are for houses, the best case is a fall of about 7% cumulative over the next 3 years. In fact, it will be a slightly smaller fall in the third year. The base case is a fall of about 30% over 3 years cumulative, and the worst case is a fall of 50% cumulative over 3 years for houses. Units a little less severely falling. There are 71% of properties that are houses, 13% are units, and 14% are other types of property. And the people ratio is 2.25, so that would suggest some families. 8.3% were vacant on census night, 1,500 properties, and the gross investment yield is on average 3.7%. So that's effectively the ratio of price relative to the average income from rent. Net investment yield is after all the costs, so that's managing the costs, paying the interest rates and other bills, etc., etc. And then that gives us a disposable monthly income of around $4,500 on average. And a typical borrower is putting about 45% of their income, or just over $2,000, on the mortgage, and just over 40%, or $1,800, on the average rent. In the current environment, one of the things I'm concerned about is people getting themselves into difficulty. And I always mention the 1-800-007-007, which is the National Debt Helpline. This is a free service. It's run by the government. And you've got financial counsellors there who can actually help and guide people if they're in difficulty. The reason I want to put this on the table again is because, in my experience, a lot of people who are getting into financial difficulty at the moment don't know who to turn to. And there is a risk. If you, for example, turn to a mortgage broker, they might say, well, just refinance and pull your equity out, but that may not be the good answer. Or you might actually go onto a website and find yourself being invited to sign up with somebody who you pay a fee to deal with your debt. Don't do that. They're actually out to make money from you rather than actually deal with it. But these guys, there's no charge. It's a free service, and it's a really good service. So 1-800-007-007 if you need help, and they can really guide you through the process of trying to work out what to do. If you are in financial difficulty, talk to your financial advisor if you've got one, or talk to the bank if you've got a mortgage. The banks are required to assist, and they do have a hardship scheme. But it is sometimes important to get your ducks in a row first. So these financial counsellors are very important. And I would say a lot of financial counsellors are extremely busy at the moment. A lot of people in difficulty, because this is a new environment. We've never seen rates go high so quick. A lot of people are highly leveraged, big mortgages. The banks overlent massively to a lot of people. And of course, they're now trying to deal with it. That's one of the reasons why the RBA kept rates, creeping up, not going up really high, because they knew a lot of people would get into difficulty. I do actually have this, which is my scenarios. This is the average for the total situation across Australia. This is houses. So basically, the best case for average across Australia is a small rise over the next 3 years. The base case is a fall down about 22%. This is for houses. The worst case for houses is a fall of 40%. So somewhere between there and there over the next 3 years. And I've got the same for units as well. So units, pretty close trajectory, but the falls for units over the next 2 and 3 years, not so high. The reason it's not such a deep fall is because they never rose as much over the last 2 or 3 years. Houses went through the roof, units didn't. So that's why. But even so, worst case scenario for units down 30%, base case down about 16%. If you would like to get a particular postcode data set, you can contact me on the blog. And if you go to the DFA blog, down at the bottom of the blog, there's a contact me little dialogue. If you send a dialogue there, I'll get it. digitalfinanceanalytics.com/blog is the link. Or if you go to digitalfinanceanalytics.com, you can go directly through to the blog from there too. So that's how you can get hold of information if you want to ask me a question, or if you want to inquire about the one-to-one service. The DFA blog is the way to do it. As I say, little dialogue down at the bottom there on the bottom right. Click on that. It will actually then take you through to the dialogue form. But do say again, I've got a backlog. I'd also make the point that if you want to get the data set, so I've been using my data set this evening, it is available for $50 per month, US dollars that is, per month. You can sign up, and if you sign up to Patreon, you can get hold of essentially the data set that I've been using tonight, and also access to the online tools that allows you to look at it remotely if you don't want to look at the Excel spreadsheets. I've also got sort of a front sheet as well. So that's what I do there. $50 US a month is the source of the data. And if you want to make comparisons between different areas, different postcodes, or even track over time, that's quite a useful tool. I guess I want to make three quick points. If you have financial pressures, don't just ignore them and they won't suddenly cure themselves. You've got to take initiatives, talk to those who know how to deal with it. Secondly, if you have a mortgage, the banks are under an obligation to try and assist. And third, things are going to get probably worse before they get better. So plan now for what may be required ahead. So those are, I think, things just to leave you with. So that concludes our edited version of the show. If you want to see the full live stream, I've put the link in the comments below. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.